Okay, I'm sure people will continue to join, but we've started to plateau. So I will just say hi, I am Jennifer Ruskin, and I'm here as your MC and representative from the ACEN Professional Learning Events Subcommittee. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands upon which each of us is for this meeting today. In my case, Macquarie University is situated on the lands of the Wallumattagal people of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture these lands since the dream time. I pay my respects to elders past and present. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you who have joined us here today. We are thrilled to have strong interest in this webinar that is co-facilitated by CRADLE, which is Deakin University's Center for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning, and ACEN, which is the Australian Collaborative Education Network. I will now introduce our three presenters very briefly. Professor Michael Tomlinson is professor in higher education, work, and employability at the Southampton Education School at the University of Southampton in the UK. He is internationally known for his extensive research in graduate employability and transitions to the labor market. His pioneering work on models, including the graduate capital model, has informed strategy and practice at universities in the UK and internationally. Michael is currently a visiting academic with CRADLE. We are delighted to have him here with us today. Professor Denise Jackson is the Director of Work Integrated Learning in the School of Business and Law at Edith Cowan University. She is Principal Fellow of Advance HE, past President of ACEN, and her work has been recognized with 2 National Teaching Awards. And Dr. Kim Dang is a senior lecturer in TESOL and languages education at the School of Curriculum Teaching and Inclusive Education in the Faculty of Education at Monash University. Her research interests include English medium instruction, teacher collaborative learning, teacher agency, professional identity, and more. She has received awards for her research, which has been published in high-impact journals. If you have questions during the presentation, please post them to the chat so they can be addressed during the Q&A. And at this point, I'll turn over to Denise.
Great, thanks, Jen, and hello to everyone, and thanks for coming along today. So we have got quite big numbers, I can see. So if you put your questions in the chat, we'll get to those at the end, and we have allocated time for questions for the panel. So what will the session be covering? First of all, we're talking about the meaning and importance of professional identity. We'll be discussing development in higher education and also the role more specifically of will in developing professional identity, and also identity formation in communities of practice. And then we'll move on to the Q&A part. So what is professional identity? You can see a few different definitions there, and you can notably see that they've kind of, there are some similarities, and they're spread over, a period of 25 years or so there. Some of the key areas that they agree on or that they relate to is around ethical professional behaviour, and also the individual developing a connection with professional values, norms and behaviours. And also the fact that this is not something that just happens, but it's evolving over time as well. And those definitions very much align to the work that Michael and I did a few years ago with students from Australia and the UK, where we explored their sense of their professional identity and how it developed in higher education. And we noted 4 different dimensions to professional identity, which you can see up on the screen there. First of all, familiarity. So that was really about the individual having an understanding of norms, values, behaviour, what's appropriate, what isn't. And that's, can be quite specific to a particular profession or industry. And really developing that in students is quite critical for them to really understand what that profession is about. And then we kind of drew out this notion of proximity, which is really around that connection that they personally feel towards that professional culture. So it's not just about them being familiar and understanding, but it's about that resonating with them. So, you know, for example, you know, you might have a student who's working, I mean, I'll take an example of myself. I used to work in a very corporate environment, very money driven, bottom line, which was not suited to me, or I wasn't suited to that. It didn't align with my personal values. I'm far more at home in a kind of education approach, community, and so forth. So it's really about alignment of personal values and professional values, and also the capabilities that you have, your strengths, your weaknesses, and those aligning to what the profession demands as well. Another aspect was networks. So really about interacting with the profession to understand about knowledge around the actual profession, the discipline of the profession, and all the capabilities and behaviours that go with that. And finally, the fourth dimension was around confidence. And that's really quite critical for students to kind of enact their professional identity, and really to kind of communicate it and also to contribute to the profession. They need to have confidence in their own capabilities and in their alignment, and almost that they're worthy of being in that profession. And that really kind of came through in the study that we did. I think also something that Michael and I have spoken about at length, and this is, you know, a difficult point, I suppose, is about professional identity development in different study fields. And to us, you know, it's quite obvious, and I'm sure to many of you, there's a spectrum, I suppose, from on the right-hand side. You can see your more occupation-specific degrees, such as nursing, midwifery, paramedicine, you know, teacher education, where it's more of a prescribed professional pathway. And really from very early in that student's degree, they can really visualize themselves in that profession. I take my daughter as an example. She's doing paramedicine and she's in her first year, and she's often walking in and out of the house with her uniform on, and she volunteers for St. John's Ambulance, and she understands and knows what it's like to be a paramedic, and she's really acting in that role from the get-go. And then we look on the left-hand side of the spectrum, and we have those more generalist degrees like arts and humanities, where it's far less obvious where those students are heading, as it were, and what their profession looks like. And then we have something in between, and I sit in a business school, and I would say that many of the degrees or the students that we have, along with IT, communications, I would say that they sit in that kind of middle area. Before moving to Michael, just a few other things around professional identity. I guess just emphasizing that it is very fluid, that it is, you know, it's very individualized, it's not linear, and it's something that's constantly evolving. And we have also discussed in our work about there might be value in differentiating between pre-professional identity and professional identity, recognizing that when students graduate, they're really at very early stages of their career, and their identity may be very much emerging, although also recognizing our diverse cohorts with mature age students and those with significant work experience. There's a bit of blurring of boundaries there. And it's relational, and I know Michael will talk about this, it's socially constructed. And I guess importantly, and that's why we're all here today, I suppose, is that this does require personal agency in order to develop professional identity. And the onus is on us in higher education to really try to facilitate that in our students in an intentional way. It's not something perhaps that would just come naturally, and it's not something that we can assume. And it is, you know, a very important aspect of graduate employability. So while the focus is often on skills, professional identity really warrants a lot of intentional and purposeful curriculum and co-curricular activities surrounding it. I'll pass over to Michael now.
Okay, thanks, Denise. And I'm going to draw upon some of the data or the thinking behind our project a couple of years ago on students' constructions of professional identity. And I think it goes around quite an important question: well, why does it matter? And I think we have to start with that. Why do we think about identity and not skills? And I think a key starting place with this is, if we think about employability as quite a contentious term in higher education, I think so much of it has been nested around concepts like skills and attributes, very sort of technicist kind of framings of the issue. And I think we're kind of have moved towards a sort of more processual, a sort of thicker way of looking at it. That's about kind of personal development, agency building, and the extent to which students are encouraged to develop kind of more agential and proactive behaviors. And I think one of the things that the key links between professional identity and employability is that way in which it might enhance people's sense of career readiness, their confidence formation, and the alignment between whatever experiences they're gaining from higher education and work-related learning and their future employment goals. So I think that's important. And related to that is this idea, which I've talked about for many years now, that employability is ultimately subjective. It's how individuals relate to the labor market, align their goals and values, and start developing a future self to navigate the multitudinous demands that take place in the labor market. And so I think we can link that then to the importance of professional identity as a key anchor in making people feel a bit more employable and enhance their self-perceived employability, which then shapes the kind of potential options and pathways that are ahead of them. So that, I think, is the kind of key starting place where how we start to frame these issues. So next slide, thanks. So one of the links with this work has been the development of different forms of capital, and this came through in the paper. And one of the key components here is this framing of identity capital. And this is really, in a nutshell, about the kind of level of investment the graduate makes towards the development of their future career and employability. And then that in turn influences their ability to narrate and articulate an employability narrative that they can take forward when they enter these different professional fields. And there seem to be kind of two kind of main components to this. I mean, one is at the sort of perceptual, self-conceptual level, which is really about the way in which students self-identify and ideate around a particular vocation or professional field, and the way in which that then shapes their thinking and planning around kind of particular sort of action frames by which they might kind of go forward to navigate that field. So I think there's a sort of self-conceptual kind of piece there with identity capital building, but also a sort of self-presentational. It's the way in which that is enacted and socially performative within the different kind of fields in which the individual is navigated. And the important issue here is how that is then affirmed by significant others in the field. So whether that's employers, co-workers, colleagues, and so forth, who are actually in a position to actually affirm those kind of identity warrants. So there's a sort of presentational and behavioral component in this. And what we find is that students who've kind of invested themselves in identity capital are likely to kind of engage with those more proactive career behaviors. So I think that's quite an important link there to what we've been finding in this these studies. Next slide, please. Another interesting thing here is the way in which something like identity capital interlinks with other forms of career capital. And I think this is quite important here. It's that sort of feeding off of different kind of career resources. So in a sense, kind of identity capital can both be a precursor and a reinforcement of kind of professional identity, but other forms of capital seem to come into work with this. And one of the important things here is the importance of social capital, which is the kind of strength of relational ties and the meaningful social connectedness with others that actually provides some kind of resource in terms of enabling people to gain kind of access to both codified and tacit knowledge about how fields operate and who are the key actors in those fields, who are the key brokers, and who can actually sort of facilitate access and development in that field. So strength of relational ties, I think, is such an important kind of facet here. And the other thing is the importance of navigating that cultural space. So much of professional work is embodied, it's enacted, it's situated. It's an interactional exchange between key agents in a workplace. And one of the important things here is this idea of socio-cultural fit. And that's kind of quite important. And one of the challenges is that some students will have developed this more readily over the course of not just their education, but their sort of more primary socialization that helps them maybe navigate these fields. And when people often say, well, if cultural capital is, predetermined, what can we do about it? Where does the role of higher education come into this? And my response is often that people have some kind of agential capacity to develop these kind of dispositions, but also professional fields are very disparate. So someone from a lower socioeconomic background going into an elite law firm or an accounting firm is likely to struggle with those coded behavioral mores that have a strong class component. But that might be different from someone going into a marketing field or a health field or an educational field. So cultures are not necessarily homogeneous and uniformed, and the challenge then is how people are able to kind of acquire those kind of cultural kind of dispositions that work or are matched in a particular cultural field. And I think that's kind of important. And this is not just about the kind of the bigger issues around, sort of how people, what clothes people wear, how they speak. It's about those nuanced things of language, for example, banter, swearing, those kind of fireside discourses that sort of require a particular kind of sort of cultural script. So I think that's quite important as well. So, I mean, one of the challenges that I think I've alluded to it before is that professional identity can be a challenge for different groups of students, first generation students. Some of the research that has been done on that and has shown that there's a kind of tension there with some students not being able to form those kind of coherent career identities, have maybe not got the kind of extended choice range of kind of options, and clearly struggle with things like social capital formation, and are aware that there are challenges of forming there's a need to develop impactful forms of social capital and deeper social ties, but not quite knowing how to do it and not being able to access kind of work experience that might facilitate that. Neurodivergent students are another example. I mean, some of the research I did last year on neurodivergent graduates. So some of these graduates might have strong identities, and develop kind of a future self that's invested in their career as a source of challenging their neurodivergence. But sometimes they struggle with the interactional spaces, managing their kind of sense of cultural fit that can actually spoil those kind of identity formations and be quite disruptive. So a lot of these graduates have talked about the importance of masking and the emotional labor that goes on in that. And I think there are kind of issues really with, international students as well. And clearly the importance of linguistic cultural capital acquisition. These all appear to be quite important as well. So one of the important things to note here is professional identity often involves some kind of merging of professional and personal interests. And I think Denise talked about the idea of resonance and identification is important. And then that potentially leaves room for attention between the extent to which people commit to an identity within a particular professional sphere going into teaching or nursing or whatever, and having a kind of exploratory role about multiple future selves that they might kind of try to craft into a professional narrative. So that's kind of an interesting tension, and I think sits across these issues. So, next slide. So, I mean, how can it be developed in higher education? And one of the challenges is that not all these experiences seem to be kind of uniform. Students study different degrees, occupational versus generalist degrees. Some are involved in tightly coupled work integrated learning, where it's clearly aligned to a professional kind of target area. Others, it's much loosely integrated. So I think one of the things is that work integrated learning can kind of greatly enrich those 4 dimensions that were talked about earlier. The proximity, the familiarity, and the networking, and the confidence, the career efficacy. So I think one of the key functions of will is to try and develop those dispositions in students. So there's just some sort of questions I sort of have raised really about implications for practice, about how we can develop links between student professional identities and their longer and immediate term outcomes. I think that would probably be an interesting sort of further area of research. The extent to which professional identity and maybe capital building becomes a part of how we think about, working with students in terms of their career development. And, how can we kind of signpost students in the university through work-related learning to develop these more holistic facets of employability? So this issue of employer engagement is quite a critical one. And the extent to which meaningful work experiences that have some kind of value and purchase are really important, rather than kind of token ad hoc sort of things which might be used just to build a CV. So it's how we can make those work experiences, paid internships, which have proper kind of mentoring involved, helpful and sustainable for students in developing their professional identity. So I'll hand over to Kim.
Sorry, just putting my thing on. It's me first, and then I'm over to Kim. Okay, thanks, Michael. So just picking up on development through will, developing professional identity. One way that I found quite useful in terms of a lens to apply to this is the self-authorship lens. And this draws on the work of Baxter and McGolder. And Baxter and McGolder identified 4 different stages that a student would go through. And to me, these stages very much resonate with me on how I can envisage those students as they go through developing their professional identity as they go. And I think it speaks as well for anyone that's on the ground working in will. When you look at these different stages, you can kind of see links between what a student goes through when they first arrive in the workplace for their work-based will opportunity, internship or placement, for example, and as they go through over time. And I'm sure for us at Working Will, many of us will see a real transformation in our students. And I must acknowledge Francisca Trede, she's here. What I will speak to in the next few minutes is really around the work that we did in a study a few years ago, which was very interesting, and it was around engaging with students and really trying to deeply explore their experiences during will and their development of professional identity. So the first stage being following formulas, and this is where a student really has very limited understanding of what their own kind of values are. They aren't willing to look within, I suppose, to answer questions. They will rather defer to someone else and take their word for it, as it were. And that's quite common to some students that are perhaps they do have less work experience and less developed social and cultural capital. And I think particularly about our students who are international students as well when they first arrive on their work placement. And as they go through, their will experience, or for students in general, they have what they call, Baxter Magolda referred to as crossroads moments, which is where things will happen to them, where they can't just rely on others. They actually have to look within, and they realize the value of looking within. And actually they have to take input, I guess, from themselves. And rather than just accepting what others say, they actually start to evaluate and critique it and think, well, hang on a minute, actually, I don't agree with that. A classic example, which we explored in our study, was students struggling with the application of theory and practice and seeing differences in workplace practice during their will experience and what they've been taught in the classroom. And they struggled with that difference, and they needed to speak up and say, well, that's not actually what we learn at university, or have you considered this other way? And there's one example of a crossroad moment. And this is also encouraged by reflection. They need to be able to reflect sometimes, to consider those, to get value from those crossroad moments and to understand them. And then moving into that self-authorship stage where they really start to trust their own thinking and their own judgment and their own voice. And that's when they start to build their own identity. And they're not bounded simply by others, still listening to them and learning from them, but also bringing their own thinking into it and molding that with, and comparing and evaluating and reflecting and making sense of this. And then finally moving into that international foundations, which is more around a quite seasoned professional, recognizing that we have career changes, we might move back to the beginning, and it's a very fluid, non-linear process. But this is where you might have, a leader who has conviction and confidence in the knowledge and the understanding that they have in a particular professional practice, and they're able to reconcile their different identities, that being their personal self, the family person. They don't walk into their workplace and have to be someone different, that it is true to them. So, I mean, that's an interesting lens if you're wanting to explore this, look at this area further. And in terms of will supporting the development of students through those stages, and also the 4 dimensions which have been mentioned earlier in the session, I'm sure as practitioners, these will resonate with you. And this is not an exhaustive list, but this is some of the ways that will can develop familiarity. So by observing professional practice, as well as actually doing tasks, so practicing being a professional, understanding the bigger organizational picture. And that's where there's value in students not being necessarily isolated, but actually being part of a larger team, or actually seeing how different teams function within an organization, and seeing how people behave in the workplace. So what is appropriate conduct, and actually visualizing, experiencing that. And then you've got the whole proximity piece, so actually developing skills, but also understanding how they're applied in different professions, different professional contexts, and also the standard that's expected of those, working with authentic real data, setting career goals or placement learning goals, being responsible for developing those goals and undertaking work, and also really getting to learn through reflective activities about themselves as well. Networking informally, formally, and then building confidence. And I'm sure many of us that work in the will space will agree that it can be quite a transformational experience for students in terms of building their confidence in their own capabilities and their worth as an emergent professional, and as someone entering into the labour market. So just moving on, designing will to enhance professional identity. And I think, again, just reiterating, I think this really requires quite purposeful, intentional design. And that was something that Francisca and I really found in the work that we did. And I've tried to break this down into the actual will opportunity, the preparation for it, and then the reflection during the actual will and after the will activity. So we saw real value in combining passive and active engagement. And I'm always saying that to my students. It's okay to just be observing and watching and listening. At lunch when people are talking, for example, you learn so much from that. Making sure that networking and engaging with others is incorporating. obviously making sure that there's goal setting and accountability, so they really can develop their own confidence in their own capabilities and actually doing something, contributing something to the profession. Integrating challenge and diverse workplace practice. I haven't got time to go through all of this, but one thing in terms of the preparation that I think is quite key is this point here about encouraging them to speak up. And that's really about them coping with and optimizing their crossroad moments. And we know that for some students, this is easier for some than others. Is for some cultures, it's not appropriate to speak up. And for less confident students, they might struggle with that. So I think it's about preparing workplace supervisors and the students on how they might want to do that. And that can be through pre-preparation training, and also empowering students to cope with those crossroad moments. So, you know, it might be through inductions, preparation modules, how to cope if there's a particular, situation occurs, how to cope with it, where there's support and so on. And lastly, reflection is critical, that whole sense making from their experience and what this means for them, and those 4 dimensions and their professional identity development, and how what they're experiencing resonates with their own personal values and their other selves, the family self, the personal self, the social self, etc. And we had some really powerful moments. We ran focus group sessions, Francisca and I, in our respective university settings, where we really encourage students to look at their crossroad moments, and it was very insightful. And I think encouraging students to do that during WIL is important. I'm now going to pass to Kim. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you, Dennis. Can you hear me? Okay, hello everyone. I'm now presenting an example from an ACEN funded project titled Establishing an Online Community of Practice Model Supporting Students' Development of Learner Agency and Professional Identity During Work Placements in Education and Engineering. So within the scope of this seminar, I will just share the example from engineering. And I will talk about the settings of the WIL, here the students' work placements, how we designed an online COP, community of practice, during WIL to deliberately enhance our students' professional identity development. And I'll also present findings about how engagement in this COP supports them in developing engineering professional identity during WIL. Next slide, please. So our project aims to examine how engagement in a supervised online Facebook private group as a community of practice dedicated for engineering students on work placement supports them in developing engineering professional identity. I will also, like in the subsequent part of this presentation, I'll also make the links between the data with what Denise and Michael have presented in discussing the development of professional identity, while also situate professional identity development in the specific discipline of engineering. Next slide, please. So the 16 engineering students who participated in our project were placed individually for 12 weeks from November 2019 to January 2020 in disparate locations and sometimes remotely across Australia, as demonstrated in the map. Next, please. So to enhance the students' PI development during their placement, we deliberately designed an online COP that brought the students together using Facebook private group platform. And on the screen, you can see the screenshot of our Facebook COP for engineering. We chose to use Facebook as it was the platform most used by the student participants in the project. And on the slide, you can also see the topics that guided our discussion on Facebook during their placement. We collected our data as we established the COP and engaged the students in the online platform about their work placements. So specifically, pre-placement, before the placement, their placement started, we established the COP and collected data via focus group discussion. And during their placement, we engaged in online COP and collected their Facebook post. And after their placement, we conducted reflective individual interviews with the students. Next, please. So our findings show that the students found the online Facebook COP useful in providing an avenue for them to discuss what they are learning and the challenges that they were facing. And there is also evidence of students' emergent development of engineering, socio-technical, professional identity, including the technicist identity that's concerned with technical engineering skills, and heterogeneous identity concerned with the soft or social engineering skills. And next one, please. So here's what some of the students said about the benefit they found with the online COP, that I'm happy to have the support. It's good to talk to other students when you get thrown in at the deep end for 3 months away. And also then say, simply knowing that there are other people I can reach out to can be very reassuring. And so they talk about sharing good lessons I learned or positive experience I had, and how the community further their connection with their fellow engineering peers, and how the COP allows more exposure to a variety of the challenges and grow their knowledge base. So the quotes here also highlight what Denise discussed earlier about aspects for designing will to enhance professional identity. For example, how this online COP provided the students with opportunity in the form of exposure to diverse workplace practice as the entire cohort, through sharing experiences and lessons learned and incorporating networking. The course also refer to the kind of social capital resources that Michael presented earlier on, which are both the precursor to and reinforcement of professional identity. Next, please. And here are some examples of the actual Facebook post and Facebook interactions when one student sought support from their COP members to optimize their learning in the work placement and hence supporting their professional identity development. Here, the student wanted to get more experience in their will, but did not know how to approach their placement supervisor. And so they posted the question in the Facebook group about how to approach their placement supervisor, and they got support from their peers. So next, please. And there are some other examples of Facebook posts where students use the platform to share and reflect on their placement experience and thought, and through that build their confidence. So that reflects what Denise mentioned earlier about the opportunity and the need for them to reflect, learn from the experience and build their confidence. So you can see on the screen, they presented, they showed what they were working on, and they shared the experience with the group. And we can see the students developing their confidence through application of skills and knowledge at the workplace, while also enhancing their sense of self through reflection in the Facebook platform. Next, please. So findings also show the students' development, emergent development of technicist identity. So technicist identity is linking to their engineering technical skills, including linking between theory taught at the university and the practice, and using engineering software, specifically a working understanding rather than only theoretical understanding, and using an understanding terminology. Next one, please. Here are some of the interview quotes towards the end of their 3 months placement to illustrate their emergent development of engineering technicist identity as evidence in their competence in using engineering software and being recognized by their workplace supervisors, and also their growing confidence. For example, PM mentioned, I'm happy to be getting comfortable with the industry-specific software. And this is his first placement. I've learned a lot in my first placement. The supervisors are happy. They use my charge plans. So his work was recognized. And for JS, he has been given the job of one of the other scheduling engineers. And he found like things pretty interesting, learning a lot this week. So these also reflect the 4 dispositions that Denise presented earlier in developing professional identity: familiarity, proximity, networks, and confidence. Next, please. So findings also show the students' development of heterogeneous identity, which concerned with people skills, linking to their communication skills, the ability to work with other people, showing initiative, and being keen to learn. So next, please. So here are some of the Facebook posts toward the end of their placement to illustrate their development of engineering heterogeneous identity. So both NB and JS, they said, NB said that, oh, as an engineer, it is super important to have people skills. It's easy for me to get on with the service crew and drillers. And while JS agree with NB and share that, oh, you can just have a laugh with people when you work together or get a job done and end up having a bit of fun with a lot of people underground. So here the quotes also illustrate the development of self-authorship when in will and professional identity, when NB and JS, they start to trust their internal voice, differs to their own identity, and start to offer new perspective. Oh, yeah, sometime in the office, everyone just logs onto the computer screen and don't get much interaction. So they have their own voice. So here's also some evidence of the socio-cultural fit Michael referred to earlier about the banter that JS mentioned about. Next, please. And here also, next, please. Yep. I think that I've gone to the next one. Yep, so that's the banter. Next one, please.
Next.
Next, yeah. Thank you. So here are some other data demonstrating how another student, MR, was developing his heterogeneous identity, people skill through a self-authorship lens. MR is moving from following formulas by saying, oh, I've been told by others in the industry, or I have been told by people industry, from that one to a more self-authorship, to more like a crossroad moment by starting to listen but not being bounded by others. He started saying, oh, it might be unfair stereotype, but yes, engineering, working on those skills is super important. So last slide, please. Yep, next one. So through our project, the findings have highlighted the value of peer learning through this online community of practice in enhancing the students' development of professional identity during work placement. And the project and the findings have implications for designing and optimizing will during work placement to foster students' construction of professional identity. That it needs to be intentional. We need to incorporate that in our design, so not let that happen haphazardly. So now I give it to Michael to share some closing remarks. Over to you, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, thanks both for sharing those interesting insights on the basis of your findings. There are a couple of things that I think are important, really, just to sort of summarize this kind of broad field. I mean, I think that professional identity is so paramount, really, in terms of helping that translation and transition, the way in which people are able to translate their higher education experiences and experience of work-related learning into the workplace, and will help manage that transition, because it's sometimes a difficult, fractious transition from higher education to work. And I think the formation of identities and related forms of career capital, I think, are now paramount, really, in helping that. And I think that cuts across some important things in terms of equity, helping students who might be marginalized or excluded from those kind of opportunities to develop, both in higher education and in the workplace. And I think, you know, gave some examples there of potentially marginalized students. And I think it's the coupling of that relationship between professional identity and professional socialization. I think they're so kind of intimately linked, really. And I think that movement, that trajectory dimension is so important. The fact that, you know, it is a iterative developmental process of working things out, breaking some patterns of learning, reformulating ideas towards those kind of crucial issues of agency and autonomy. And, you know, to use the term that Denise has drawn upon, self-authorship. The extent to which people, I think with authorship, is that the important thing is narrating. And I think it's that sort of issue of being able to narrate and present an identity that can be developed through HE and most importantly will, and then that gets kind of projected into those workplaces to negotiate not only access to a professional field, but legitimacy and acceptability within. I think there's a strong kind of relational dimension to work-related learning. I think that's so important that it's mediated through those relationships with significant others in terms of professional formation, and the quality of those relationships and interactions therefore become key, I think, in understanding this. And so the role and advocacy of others in helping people develop is crucial to help people make that trajectory from kind of novice to, you know, legitimate and expert actors in their field. And I was kind of interested in some of the binary tensions that often get thrown up when we think about work-related learning. Kim mentioned some interesting ones here. You know, how do you reconcile the need to demonstrate, you know, technical competence with, you know, those more socio-affective components that are so important in workplaces? You know, there's so much kind of cultural richness and cultural you know, work that needs to be done in organizations. So not weighting your professional identity just around one and thinking of that sort of complementation rather than compartmentalization of those different ideas is important. How do you kind of reconcile the idea of the, you know, the personal worlds that people have and their professional interests? And sort of, I think a theme that comes out is that kind of interface between the professional and the personal is really, really important. And I mean, a theme that's come out over the last few days is the way in which, you know, new developments in the digital world and AI raise important implications for the design of work integrated learning opportunities and the extent to which learning can be scaffolded in work integrated learning opportunities for students, the way you wrap around learning onto work related places. How does AI come into this? To what extent it can meaningfully scaffold, to what extent it can kind of build people's professional identity and agency. I think we're in early days with that, but I think there is some potentially interesting future directions of travel with that.
Great, thanks, Michael, for those closing thoughts. And I'm just mindful of time, so we've got around 10 minutes just to whip through some questions. And there are some meaty ones in the chat there. There's some, Kim, which are specifically around the kind of logistics and platforms and so on. So maybe you can connect with those people afterwards and answer those questions directly. Might go instead to the more kind of general questions around responsibility for the development of professional identity. There's one question in particular from David Bowd. I'll just read it out. The development of professional identity has not been something that universities have traditionally taken direct responsibility for. what is a legitimate role for the curriculum and organised preparation and development, and what goes beyond that and remains as an individual's responsibility, albeit with some resources from the university. I might just make a couple of points on that, and then I'll pass perhaps to Michael. I guess my view on this is really in communicating to students about the importance of developing employability, and I do think we need to intentionally do that right from the start, because there's a lot of research that shows that students genuinely they don't necessarily think about this. They think they've got to university, and sometimes that is enough. I think it's really about building awareness of this aspect of employability and the importance it plays. And one hook that might be a good one could be around the role that it plays in graduate recruitment. As Michael spoke to about affirmation, we have gatekeepers, we have HR, graduate coordinators, and they really play a role in affirming a student's professional identity or not. And students really need to have a narrative around their professional identity. So I think one role for higher education is to build awareness on the importance of it, and also facilitate ways to develop through things like will, co-curricular activities, and some of the different things that we've discussed in the session, and making sure that they incorporate reflection and challenge and that mentorship through crossroad moments. Michael, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the important things is that it's a perennial issue that isn't going to go away. Universities get measured on graduate outcomes, and it's clearly a sticking point. But I think one of the challenges we have is to try and encourage engagement with career development, but not in a kind of top-down sort of way that students feel it's an obligation to engage in that, but it's kind of embedding it into that kind of wider landscape of practice, to use Denise's term. So the way in which you kind of bring together those kind of nested elements of the co-curriculum, the extracurriculum, the actual formal curriculum, and not seeing them as separate. And the other kind of thing really is that, it's really about kind of, providing those kind of opportunities to students to not think really in terms of there being a separation between the vocational and the academic. And I think that for too long, that bifurcation, if you like, between the academic and the vocational has kind of troubled the way in which we sometimes think about that, and sometimes that message can be quite difficult to get through to the academic community, to career practitioners, and so forth. So yeah, that's all I'd add.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to move to another question, and then I'll come to you afterwards as well, Kim. So this is a question from Tom. How much are we teaching students to act out a role? As an Australian male from a STEM discipline, I had considerable difficulty as an international student in a class of mostly Canadian female humanities teachers. They introduced themselves by referring to their husbands, children, dogs, and wilderness snow sports, which I had none of. So I'm looking at your first sentence there in that question, and it's an interesting one. And to me, that alludes to that whole issue around having a visualized, prescribed professional pathway, which might not be applicable in STEM disciplines. And I do think there's a real tension around that. And I do think this is an area for future research exploration. But I think rather than preparing students for a role, I think that's actually something that we need to kind of actively avoid, and rather prepare them as broadly as possible in a way. But there are difficulties with that, because if they can't visualize, then it's harder for them to grasp. But the reason why I say that is obviously in some disciplines there is less visualized, prescribed pathway, but also because professions are evolving so much that what we think might be a good pathway to prepare for looks quite different in a few years' time anyway. So I guess just trying to find a way that prepares students broadly in terms of appropriate professional conduct, understanding the their own worth and values in the labour market and how that's evolving could be quite helpful. But that's a really good point. It's a difficult area. Kim, I don't know if you have anything to add on that, or Michael. I'll go to Kim first. Or we can pass to Michael.
Sorry, not really, beyond what you've articulated there, Denise. Yeah.
Okay, Kim, anything? If not, we'll move on.
Yeah, I think that you have done it beautifully, Dennis. Yeah, don't have anything else to add.
I would
Yep.
say, I mean, there's an interesting thing there just about disruption, the extent to which, that kind of role conformity and role fitting kind of delimits people's capacity to challenge and disrupt organizations. That fits in a bit with the confidence and self-authorship. When you've got that, you're able to kind of maybe try and challenge, disrupt. If cultures can be exclusionary, or they can be unhealthily hostile, or whatever, or just that kind of having that confidence to who to ask, how to disrupt those kind of more difficult things. If that is kind of what the example is sort of referring to.
Yeah, and also being adaptable, I suppose, and that's again comes back to having that confidence of being operating, being able to have the confidence and capability and adaptability to operate in different, to adapt yourself, I guess, to different contexts. A question from Anna. My question is about will as a pre-professional opportunity for identity development, ideally authentic and consequential, but also a safe time/space to make mistakes. For example, a student realizing they've overstepped or underestimated expectation standards. This experiences might crush an emerging professional identity or else be the making of it. I'd love to hear any thoughts, strategies for navigating that kind of turbulence that is so often associated with formative pre-professional encounters such as will. I think that's a great point and question. And I think that really makes a strong argument for a couple of things. And one is scaffolding activities. So you start small, bite-sized when they first come into their degree, and build things up. So you're not kind of catapulting students into a very meaty capstone experience in their final year, having had no exposure to safe places where they can practice authentic learning. And you've got a host partner who doesn't think it's okay to fail. And because if they need a particular piece of work done, I think that's one thing. So preparation and scaffolding. I think another thing is trust us as educators trying to communicate to industry partners that this is a primary is a learning experience. But that gets very difficult if a student's on a paid placement and they're essentially an employee, which does happen and which we're pushing for as well in many ways through the focus on placement poverty. And also Sonia made a comment later about the importance of having a mentor and a guide on the side when students are going through those crossroad moments, and that can incorporate some of the things you're talking about, making mistakes and failing or overstepping or challenging moments, I think is important. Michael, anything to add?
Nope.
Kim?
Yes, I can add. Yep. That's very interesting question about the preparation, and actually developing identity is not a short term. It's not like you can't do it within a very short time frame. So I fully agree with what Dennis mentioned earlier about starting earlier, like for higher education as early as possible. And one way to do that is through like employability, but it's very important to let the student be aware of the importance of developing their professional identity. And professional identity also links to the sense of self and the conception of the discipline. What does it mean to be an engineer? What does it mean to be a teacher, to be a social worker? So that kind of conception goes beyond how much you know about the field to also your direction to who you are working with, and also all the ethical values that you mentioned earlier, Denise. And why I didn't have time to talk about my other studies, but other studies that I have done also illustrate and show how their prior experience have an impact on how their identity develops. So what it means is that it takes time to develop, and we need to, within higher education, if possible, we need to start as early as possible, even from the first year, and not only through the will experience, but we can also include that through other curriculum activities as well. I think that is a big question, but what I mean to say is that it is a long term, and there will be bumpy roads, there will be contradictions when they have to negotiate different identity, negotiate different values. But when they do that, when they do negotiate, that's how they learn and they can transform. So, yep, and over to all of us for our responsibility in this area. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. And I'm looking at the clock, and it's time for us to pass over to Jen. I know there are questions we haven't addressed. I'm sorry, it's such a meaty topic, but thanks everyone, and over to you, Jen.
Thank you. And I'll just say a big thank you to Michael, Denise, and Kim for sharing your research and insights. At this point, the ACEN Professional Learning Committee would like to take a few screenshots. If you are open to being part of the sort of memory of this and posted to socials, please keep your cameras on. If you do not consent, turn them off, and we'll take a few screenshots now. And with that, I think we'll wrap up. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you and to learn on this topic.